It's my great pleasure to welcome to the podium the Chairman of Asia House, Lord Green.
Michael, thank you, and it's a very great pleasure and an honour for me to be here, standing at this lectern in front of a group of people that is both extremely distinguished and in very many cases very familiar faces, because I've known them over the years in different places, different contexts, and in my case different incarnations. It is a great pleasure to be taking over as Chairman of Asia House, and I follow in the footsteps of somebody who I think has given an extraordinary amount to Asia House. He's not here this evening because I happen to know that a very good friend of mine is taking him out to dinner this evening. But you all know John Boyd well. You know what he delivered to Asia House. He is, I think, he's certainly the only person that I know who speaks very good Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, as well as being able to talk to you in a very learned and extraordinarily well-informed way about literature, music, art, and practically anything else that you would want to talk about. And then on top of all that, he served Asia House through some difficult times and brought it to a new stability, as well as getting in a strong management team led by Michael Lawrence. And so I reckon that the task of chairman going forward is really quite easy. It's in a sound financial condition. That wasn't always the case, but it is now. And I think we are, therefore, at a very interesting stage, thanks to the work that John put in with Asia House, where we can look to a new and exciting phase in its development. And of course, there's nothing more important in my mind than that London in the 21st century should have a vibrant, flourishing Asia House. Asia House should be the meeting point for kind of anybody interested in the extraordinary phenomenon which is Asia. Whether it's because you do business there or want to do business there, or whether it's because you're an Asian looking at this part of the world to do business in or to invest in, or whether it's just because you're a European, or indeed come to that from any other part of the world, who is deeply fascinated by the extraordinary phenomenon of Asia. One way or another, Asia House should be of real meaning to you. And an Asia House in London is all the more important because of London's role in Europe and in the wider world. It is, by any standards, Europe's most cosmopolitan city, and in fact, by some measures, it's the most cosmopolitan place on the planet. It is a great crossroads, and at this particular juncture in its history, with Brexit and all that, impacting in ways that we don't fully understand on London's future, but I think on the whole, London is adaptable enough that it will continue to flourish and continue to be a great crossroads. It is therefore more important than ever that Asia House be here to tell the story of Asia, its changes, its astonishing vibrancy, and the way in which it will impact us all. The headlines about Asia are familiar to us all, are they not? It's a big place. What's been going on economically for the last generation is extraordinary, often described as the emergence of a great new series of new economies. I actually think better described in many of them, and certainly in the case of both China and India, as the re-emergence of great economies. What is going on is a shift in the centre of gravity from the west to the east, describable, I think, as the great convergence that puts right the gap that opened up from the 1820s onwards with the Industrial Revolution. It used to be said in America that somebody who wanted to make their way in the world was best advised in that famous phrase to go west, young man. I would now say that the advice for the 21st century is go east, young person, because of all that is happening in Asia. Nobody who wants a serious career, a strong contribution to modern life in this part of the world can do it if they haven't got a reasonable experience of all that is happening in Asia. It is a complex phenomenon. Sometimes we talk about Asia as though it was just China and the Far East. Sometimes we focus just on India and South Asia, as though they were the only things, and of course they are extremely important to Asia. But there is the increasingly important phenomenon of ASEAN, a trading bloc that includes nearly 700 million people and is on its way to creating a single market without, I think, or with a fair chance of, avoiding the mistakes made in Europe. And then there are other important centers of influence in Asia: Iran, Turkey, Russia, which we often think of as a country that is primarily European, but actually it's primarily Asian in so many ways. Yes, the numbers are large. 4.5 billion people, 60% of the world's population, declining percentage of the world's population, interestingly. Taken together with Europe, it's 2/3 of the world's population. Urbanization, which was at around 20% in 1950, is now at 50%, and on the conventional forecast will head to above 70% by 2050. Fertility rates, which were at 5.8 in 1955, are now down to 2.2 and heading to 2.0, in other words, below replacement rate, by 2030 for Asia as a whole. And the pattern of this is interesting. Delving into the detail is interesting. It is interesting to note, for instance, that Iran's fertility rate is 1.7, in other words, well below replacement rate. Turkey is at 2.1, at exactly replacement rate. And Indonesia is at 2.3 and heading downwards towards replacement rate. I mentioned those three countries for an obvious reason. They have one thing in common, practically only one thing in common, and yet they are all, like all of the other Asian economies, heading towards a demographic position where the growth is slowing rapidly and will cap out something like a generation after they reach fertility replacement rate. But some interesting things are happening. India will overtake China in population within the next 2 years on the most recent and reliable numbers. Turkey overtakes Germany next year, and Iran overtakes Germany next year in terms of population size. The market significance of all of that, in a sense, doesn't need to be spelled out. These are increasingly affluent, large, still growing markets that are demographically beginning to age, with all of the implications that has for business. The infrastructure implications are vast. This is a vast area, of course, and in particular led by the Chinese government. The whole One Belt, One Road initiative, it's called various things, more romantically the New Silk Road, is going to transform the face of the Eurasian landmass. You already see it if you look at patterns of railway networks. Actually, if you go back to 1900 and then look at 1950 and look at now and look at the announced plans for 2030 or 2040, you can see it in the patterns of railway development. You can see it in the development of Pakistan's new port of Gwadar, which will link up through the China-Pakistan economic corridor into the East-West Silk Road movement. You can see it in the proposals for a Singapore-Kunming railway link that will link up down that axis as well. And by the way, there are now 2 trains a week that run from Duisburg to Chengdu. Things are changing, things are connecting up, but there is, of course, so much more to do. I was at a conference back in the autumn, courtesy of, dare I mention them, Chatham House, in Seoul. This was a conference to explore the northern implications of the One Belt, One Road concept. And you had there China, Japan, Russia, and Korea talking about how the ports of the northern part of that part of the world, so Fukuoka and Vladivostok and Tianjin and Busan, could link up and develop an approach that opens up some of the north and northeastern routes for trade. It's getting more complex, it's getting more intricate, it's very exciting, and of course it also means they're becoming more and more into contact with each other. A journey from one end of the Eurasian landmass to the other end Time was when it took you years, and it was very dangerous. Now it's 15 hours if you get on a plane and just fly from one end to the other. And what that means is that societies that up until relatively recent times have had relatively little to do with each other are becoming increasingly familiar with each other. And the possibilities for trade and investment, but also for geopolitical tension, are of course very obvious. This isn't completely new news. After all, if you look at the Greeks and the Persians, they were at each other's throats in the 4th century before Christ. Han China was developing its westward approach around the turn of the modern era. Then came the Muslims and the armies that spread out from Arabia into Iran and beyond, up into Central Asia, and of course also along the Mediterranean coast, and then the Mongols, and then the Europeans. One wave after another of contact, which has often been violent, but which then typically leads, after a while, to stabilization, new contacts, and new possibilities for mutual benefit. It's one of the reasons, all of this, why it's very important that Asia House not only focuses on the business implications of Asian connectivity, the investment implications of Asia connectivity, but also our cultural program. I think it is very important that we help those who want to engage in Asia, and indeed Asians who want to engage here and in Europe, to understand more of each other, and that takes you into the cultural domain. Asia is, after all, the home to some of the most ancient and richest cultures in the world. You have China, India, Iran, the Greco-Roman European civilization. These are all ancient, rich cultures that can offer so much to each other, and it is part of the role of Asia House to make sure that we help people unlock some of those precious secrets, because A, it's enriching and valuable in its own right, but B, it helps us relate constructively and profitably in business terms with each other. So the next 50 years in Asia, I think they will offer plenty of scope for us to be very busy. There are many changes taking place. China, of course, emerging as the second largest economy in the world and the largest economy in Asia. Its demographics are undergoing fundamental change. All sorts of questions about how it evolves over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. India, which, as I've already mentioned, will overtake China demographically very shortly, but is a long way behind economically and a long way behind in the degree of urbanization. Probably 20% less of the population of India is urbanized compared with China, and that will change over time. Huge diversity. 22 official languages, and these aren't just dialects of each other, these are utterly different language groups. Where will India go over the next generation? Now under the leadership of a Prime Minister who's very determined that India should rediscover its cultural roots, its earlier identity, if you will. All sorts of implications posed by that. By what is, in many ways, a significant attempt to roll back the secularizing heritage of the original independence settlement. Iran, always conscious of its distinctiveness, of its 2,500-year-old history, at least 2,500-year-old, different from every other Muslim country. Not Arabic, doesn't speak Arabic, doesn't think of itself Arab. Contrast Egypt, for instance, two countries which became Muslim at around the same time, but they've evolved very differently. Turkey, sailing into difficult seas over the next few years economically, problematic relations with all its neighbors, like India, like Russia, seeking to rediscover an older identity and to roll back a secularizing inheritance. There are interesting things going on in so many different parts of Asia. And so, understanding the geopolitics is important to understanding the economic potential. And understanding the geopolitics is underpinned by understanding the identity, the cultural background in which these issues play themselves out. I think there is rising uncertainty in the world at the moment. There are challenges within the world of Islam. There are specific threats to the stability of the region. North Korea, very obviously. I mentioned that conference I was at in Seoul back in the autumn. Our agenda was to talk about northern connectivity as part of the One Belt, One Road strategy. We spent a lot of time in practice talking about North Korea. Demography and the environment. This is clearly going to be a challenge for many Asian countries, for China, for India, for Southeast Asia. It's interesting to note that Eurasia, if you take away the extremely cold and largely uninhabitable areas, is one of the most densely populated parts of the planet. Those 2/3 of human population that I mentioned who live on the Eurasian landmass mean that the density of Asia and Europe is much higher than the world average. The world average, just in case you are interested in knowing, is 54 people per square kilometre. The US is 32 per square kilometre, so the US is less densely populated than the world average. But China is at 142, India's at 394, Bangladesh at 1100, Russia is just 8. That's the point about large areas of essentially uninhabitable tundra. The UK, by comparison, is 250. So Europe and Asia are very crowded places. It's one of the factors that drives the way identity works, the way politics works, and the obvious opportunities that arise economically. I could go on about water issues, energy issues. There will be plenty of food for Asia House to be getting its teeth into. And then on top of all of that, there is, of course, President Trump. President Trump, we don't yet know for sure what all this means, but it quite clearly has an impact both in Europe, and we all know that, and also in Asia. What does that mean in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Seas? What does the fact that his very first executive action was to abandon TPP mean? What does it mean on the Korean Peninsula? What does it mean for relations with Russia? And how do all of the issues about the uncertainty of US policy now spill over into our daily concerns, whether we're in Asia or at this end of the Eurasia landmass? So Trump is definitely a phenomenon. Brexit, speaking more parochially of the British, is clearly going to change some things. But if you believe the government strategy as announced by Theresa May last week, what it means is a very determined effort to become global Britain, to act as a champion of open trade around the world. Note, by the way, how very different the rhetoric of the Brexit campaign and the Trump campaigns are and were. And so I think you're going to see in the British government a very serious effort to build yet further connectivity with Asia. And again, I think that's good news for Asia House. It is absolutely part of our remit to be explaining to our members and friends as the events unfold what Brexit means for doing business in this country as an Asian, doing business in that part of the world as a British company or business. What are the implications in the way Britain and the EU relate to each other going forward for strategy in Asia and so forth. So the times are interesting, in short. That phrase, often attributed entirely wrongly to Confucius, was, by the way, Robert Kennedy who originally used it, as far as we can tell. The times are interesting, but not, I think, just in the sense that the curse of a curse, as was meant in the way the phrase is so often used. I think the times are genuinely interesting. Yes, there are plenty of challenges. Yes, the risk to the world's trading systems is probably greater now than it has been for some time. But yes, also, there are lots and lots of opportunities in an Asia which is dynamic, changing fast, going to look very different in 50 years' time from now, and is both an opportunity as well as certainly a challenge for all Europeans who seek to engage in it. And all of that means, as I say, that we in Asia House are here on the map at the right time, in the right place, and we've got plenty of work to do. Thank you very much.